You're going to cover this whole thing? Yeah.
Yeah, spread out.
Really doesn't feel like have to dodge your.
So I guess that's where the bases come in.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Bethany Sargent, and I work as the Lake Champlain Outreach Coordinator, the Clean Water Initiative Program, and I'm joined by Kari Dolan, who is Clean Water Initiative Program Manager, and Mike Middleman will be joining us shortly. Kari is going to present along with Mike on our progress meeting Lake Champlain total maximum daily loads, so a report on the accountability framework. For those folks online, if you have any technical difficulties, if you could just instant message on through Skype for Business, I could try to help you out in that. And then we have a number of folks in the room and a number of folks online. So for those who are online, if you could just ask any questions via instant message, and then I can field them in the room. And Kari, should I clarifying questions as you go through, and then we can leave some time for questions at the end? Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, great. Well, I will turn it over to Kari.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kari Dolan with the Clean Water Initiative Program, and we're here to talk about the Lake Champlain TMDL Accountability Framework. So if you don't know anything about Lake Champlain, TMDLs, or even Lake Champlain, don't worry. I'll cover a little bit of some background as to why we're here today. But this is really an opportunity to get caught up on ways in which the state and its partners are addressing our water quality challenges with respect to Lake Champlain Basin, and to really engage you all in the public to be part of this restoration work. It's obviously the lakes, our lake, our rivers and lakes across the state are our rivers, they're our water quality standards. They're important to us, and we look forward to working closely with you for the protection and restoration of these waters. And these are the reasons for why we care about our waters. They're important as community assets. We use our waters for recreation, for drinking, and for other purposes. And they truly are and do provide an important asset for our communities to enjoy, certainly for this generation and future generations. But we are a rural state, and we know much of our water quality challenges are associated with rainfall and snow melt hitting our ground, and depending on what's on that ground, can cause and contribute to water quality challenges, especially when that ground is bare or is in gravel form, it's in a steep terrain or adjacent to waters. That rainfall and snow melt can pick up the sediments and litter and deliver it to the closest surface water. And we know that the struggle is that phosphorus, the pollutant of concern here, is ubiquitous. It's in our soils, and so when you have runoff and erosion, you're also delivering some of these nutrient pollutions that we're struggling with. And this is a kind of an expression, this slide, showing a algal bloom in a portion of the northern portion of Lake Champlain. And this is the pollutant of concern. Nutrient pollution can cause and contribute to these algal blooms. The lake works very well as a sink, so when all our rivers are delivering some of these pollutants, the end result could look like this, unfortunately, in some parts of the lake and sometimes during the year. And this is in addition to trying to improve those local assets of our streams and lakes upstream of Lake Champlain, we're also trying to be mindful of the impacts it has downstream. This slide summarizes, again, why we care about clean water. Our water resources are fundamental to the Vermont brand. They're important, as I mentioned, for our use and enjoyment, but they're also significant in terms of helping to support the economic condition of our state. We are a tourism and recreational-based economy. It's tourism and recreation. It's some $2.5 billion in revenues in the state, and our water resources are a fundamental part and value to this part of our economy. And therefore, what we do to improve and maintain clean water can certainly help our economy locally, and help maintain our property values. And Lake Champlain is a large lake. It's a water body that's shared between New York, Quebec, and Vermont. It drains about half of Vermont, and much of that drainage comes from the land, meaning that, again, it emphasizes how important it is to be thoughtful and mindful of what we do on the landscape because of the drainage into our lake. And as I mentioned, it's a large lake. It's the 6th largest natural lake in the U.S. And I do want to emphasize that although it's shared between these other jurisdictions, Vermont has a little bit larger share of the basin, and certainly a larger share of the dairy industry in Vermont side of the lake. In fact, I think we support some 60% of New England's milk production. And therefore, it's really another really important part of our economy. And so what we can do to help farmers and municipalities to address these water quality challenges is only going to help our economy. And this is why we have the so-called TMDL, or restoration effort, underway for Lake Champlain. This slide shows that wherever you stand within Lake Champlain, we're struggling with trying to meet our water quality standards for phosphorus, the pollutant of concern. What we're showing here is a series of charts. The blue line, dotted horizontal line, is our water quality standard. It changes depending on where you are in the lake because of localized lake conditions. And the trend line of our data shows phosphorus concentrations is not only typically above that water quality standard, meaning we're not meeting our Vermont standards, but it's also trending in the wrong direction. So we need to do more. We need to be smarter in how to target those dollars. We need to create this partnership with all sectors of our economy to address these problems, and we need to start to bend this curve over time. The TMDL, this total maximum daily loads, first effort was to get a sense for what's contributing to our water quality challenges. And as I mentioned, we're a rural state, meaning 94% of our water quality challenges that are contributing to the phosphorus pollutant loading is associated with the runoff and that rainfall and snowmelt hitting the ground and running off into the surface. What we show in yellow in that northern slice of this pie is the wastewater treatment plants, those point sources, what we call point sources. They're discharging from a pipe, and they only represent about 4%. Why? It's because over the last 20, 30 years, we have invested quite a bit in wastewater treatment upgrades to drive those phosphorus pollutant loads down. And the result is it's still a source, but a smaller source. And we also recognize over the last 20 years, we've invested quite a bit on manure storage in the agricultural sector. So even though we show 41% here, when you look at manure storage and production facilities, that number is smaller, meaning that much of that wedge is related to land, the field-based practices. But overall, what we see in red, or shades of red and orange, are the impacts, the loading from our hard surfaces related to paved roads and parking lots. I mentioned about the agricultural lands. River instability is sort of a function of two problems. One is a historic and legacy effect from the generations of channelizing our rivers, making them straight, cutting off rivers' access to floodplains. And that river instability still contributes to nutrient pollution. But it's also a function of all that water we shut down through our ditches into our receiving waters, whether you're in an urban environment or even a rural environment. And that, too, contributes to some of that river instability. And forest land is actually on an acre-by-acre basis. It's very small, but since 70% of the basin is in forest cover, and various qualities of forest cover, it does represent a source that we still are addressing within the context of TMDL. And what we are talking about here with respect to reducing pollutant loads is not to go to zero. We all live on this landscape, but it's to reduce it to enough to meet our water quality standards. And about 4 years of effort going into the development of this TMDL determined that if we can reduce the pollutant loads across all these sectors by about 34% over 20 years, we should be in pretty darn good shape for meeting our standards. And I do want to emphasize that last 4 or 5 years in developing that TMDL involved quite a bit of effort with you all, with members of the public, with concerned citizens, with all the sectors. Quite a bit of conversation about what we need to do together in Vermont, working together to address these problems across all these sectors. And so what we show here in some of those big milestones is the release of the TMDL, which has the actual quantified numbers, pollutant load reductions we need to achieve. This, what we call the Phase 1 implementation plan, which represents Vermont's commitments, policy commitments to meeting those targets. And where we are now is the implementation and a tracking and reporting system to keep you all engaged, involved in this effort. And this accountability framework is part of this implementation effort. So as I mentioned, EPA had released what's called the Phosphorus TMDLs for Lake Champlain segment to the Lake Champlain, Vermont segments to Lake Champlain. And I say TMDLs because there's a restoration plan and effort for each of the tributaries coming into the lake. And here's a link to where you can get into to access the TMDL. And as I also mentioned, well, in addition to the Phase 1 plan, the legislature passed Act 64, which we endearingly refer to as the Vermont Clean Water Act, and that provided just additional authorities to Vermont to implement the Lake Champlain TMDL that primarily focused on agricultural water quality management, impervious surface stormwater management, including roads, and a new clean water fund to help support implementation. I had mentioned earlier the Phase 1 implementation plan is about the Vermont policies and programs that we committed to establishing to help with the implementation. It, in addition to those Act 64 elements, it also addresses some of the natural resource restoration goals that include rivers, wetlands, and forests. It turns to the use of what we call tactical basin plans as our Phase 2 effort. Building on the Phase 1, which lays out those commitments, Phase 2 is the actual implementation roadmap for how we're going to achieve these pollutant reductions for each of those watersheds. And this new Clean Water Initiative to really promote this interagency collaboration to implement, track, and report on our progress over time. So basically the TMDL, because no one was left unaffected from this restoration effort, we really look to it as an all-in approach towards achieving clean water, certainly for Lake Champlain, but ideally if we can help support our water quality challenges across the state to aid communities to maximize those economic values of having clean water in their backyards as well. So we're all in, meaning that this is a Vermont approach towards collaboration, working together, identifying problems, targeting our work, and being transparent on what we're investing in, how we're doing, whether we're meeting our goals. And it's so fundamental about the partnerships, the watershed groups, conservation districts, regional planning commissions, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, other organizations, farmer groups, municipalities. It's all about working together to achieve this common goal. We're starting to, we've issued 2 interagency annual reports. This is the most recent one released in January. Here's a link to it to, again, keep you engaged as to how we're doing, how we're tracking our progress over time. So I encourage you to take a look at that report. It provides information about our investments, the outcomes of those investments, quantified in nature, such as acres of cover crop installed or acres of stormwater managed, and also pollutant reduction potential. This is, again, keep in mind, this is the beginning of a 20-year effort, but this annual report really helps us ensure that keeps our fingers on the pulse to see how we're doing and how we can improve and our progress. Now, this accountability framework is fundamental towards keeping us on track to meeting our commitments described in the Phase 1 plan, keeping us compliant to that Act 64, and ensuring that we're meeting our implementation targets over time. So the purpose is really it's actually embedded right in the TMDL. On pages 49 to 59. And it's to provide the public and everyone involved a transparent way of how we're gauging Vermont's progress in meeting those commitments and our water quality improvements. Now, we're not alone. There are other states that are using this similar model, which is actually functioning as a backstop, helping us to ensure that we're not slipping backwards in missing our targets over time. It's going to really enable us to keep on track to meeting our reduction goals. Now, it includes a number of important elements. It has enforceable milestones. Certainly, EPA looked at, Environmental Protection Agency looked at our Phase 1 plan, and we have quite a number of commitments made in that plan. But what we tried to do with this accountability framework, what EPA tried to hone in on is which of those promises, which of those commitments are actually enforceable. And those are the ones that will really help to redirect our resources to ensure that we're being successful in implementing this plan. It's to be used to evaluate our progress in implementing those Phase 2 plans, those roadmaps for recovery. And it, unfortunately, because it's serving as a backstop, it also has federally imposed consequences should we fail to meet the expectations under that accountability framework. In our minds, though, in recognition that these are our waters, Vermont's waters, these are our backyard streams that feed into Lake Champlain. These are our water quality standards, Vermont's water quality standards. So although EPA was instrumental in the development of and the release of the TMDL, the Phase 1 plan, the commitments are Vermont's commitments, and we care about making sure that we're going to be successful in implementing this TMDL. And so in our minds, a really important benefit of this accountability framework is that it spurs a real transparent and comprehensive tracking of the state's progress across all sectors. It creates greater accountability for pollutant reductions by sector over time, and it guards against us making overly zealous assumptions that we will achieve these pollutant reductions without anything behind it. So it's really trying to keep our feet to the fire and keeping the public engaged who are very interested in making sure we're successful. And that, hence, again, further justifies why that partnership and collaboration with the public and interested parties is so important to make sure we, as Vermonters, are going to be successful. So as I mentioned, the accountability framework is actually embedded as part of the TMDL on pages 49 and 59. And let's go, if you don't mind, I'd like to dive right into it. Now, there's 2 milestone periods contained in this accountability framework. The first is looking at the first couple of years of this TMDL, what we call period 1. And the intent here is just to ensure that Vermont is establishing, they describe these commitments in the Phase 1 plan, but let's make sure that we actually complete the programs and the policies necessary to lay the foundation for implementing the TMDL. So there's some 16 elements in the first year of this first year period, and then another 12 milestones in the second year of this first milestone period. And again, to focus on those major milestones related to programs and permits, and to ensure that we have the enforcement mechanisms in place to focus on implementation. And so EPA put us on an annual evaluation process where the first year of this milestone would be just an interim check-in to see that we're on target for meeting the this first milestone period. So they took that first milestone period, that 2015 to 2017, broke it into 2 years. In the first year, they provided us an interim report card. So we provided them a spending plan, capacity plan, and then they provided us a letter last year that said, hey, you guys are doing pretty good. Keep it up. And so everything looked as if we were on target for meeting the expected milestones. And here's a link where you can access, again, on our Restoring Lake Champlain website, you can access both the spending plan capacity report from December 2016 and EPA's support letter for their interim report card. Now, that was year 1. Year 2 is where it really counts. So year 2 is when we're going to get the final report card for this first milestone period. And it's focusing on specifically the degree to which we completed those 16 elements in the first year and the 12 elements in the second year. And although it was to look at the completion of those elements by December 2017, we asked for a little bit more time in preparing an accountability framework report. Because why? Because we were just finishing some of our policies and programs by the end of the year, and we had the second interagency investment report due in January, and we had asked if we could have more time in submitting this report, and they said that would be fine. They accommodated us in that request, and then we also wanted to make sure we were on target in terms of preparing the information they seek to effectively evaluate our performance. So, if you don't mind, we're going to dive into some of the detail here, and I do have Mike Middleman here from the Agency of Agriculture. So when we have questions, I'm going to actually walk you through this and then entertain questions at the end. But here we're within the first milestone period, year 1, due in December. The Agency of Agriculture was they recognized that the Agency of Agriculture needed to, as described in the Phase 1 plan in Act 64, committed to a number of tasks. And they accommodated us by listing those tasks that we had already agreed to, related to establishing the required agricultural practices. Within that effort, have a small farm certification program rule, to include a livestock exclusion incentive program to keep the cows out of the drink, develop a matrix and small farm template for nutrient management planning as a means to help smaller farms understand the value of nutrient management planning and how they can develop those plans to help keep their soil on the ground as opposed to having it wash away or erode away. To develop a new environmental stewardship incentive program, which is to acknowledge and even incentivize those farms that are doing above the actual under a permit program, and to use those farms as great role models. To develop a certification program for custom manure applicators so that they know how to best apply manure in a environmentally conscientious manner. To develop requirements for farmer training programs to get all farms comfortable and familiar with the required agricultural practices and the expectations of farmers in meeting those practices. And to revise an interagency memorandum of understanding between the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets and the Agency of Natural Resources associated with the Agricultural Non-Point Source program. There were other elements in that first year, those 16 elements that we needed to establish. 3 dealt with stormwater. They wanted to ensure that we were on target for issuing the final TS4 permit for our state highway system managed by the Vermont Agency of Transportation. We use the term TS4 to stand for it doesn't really clarify the meaning for it, but it stands for the Transportation Separate Storm Sewer System. But it's basically a statewide permit for the Vermont Transportation Agency to effectively manage stormwater runoff off of the state highway system. To adopt a final Vermont Stormwater Management Manual, we updated this is the rule book for developers as they build across the landscape, and we enhanced it with new tools to help them meet those pollutant reductions, and to update the forestry acceptable management practices specific in our which help loggers and foresters minimize and avoid impacts during logging operations. So these check marks, by the way, indicate that we've met those expectations, but I've also indicated using notes additional information associated with these key elements. So under forestry AMPs, although we updated the acceptable management practices by October of 2016, we are undergoing a second revision already because we recognized we made a slight error and we forgot to address permanent bridges on intermittent streams. So we are in the process of updating the acceptable management practices to close that gap. And with respect to funding, the request was to ensure that the legislature was going to establish a clean water improvement fund, which we did with the Clean Water Fund, and to provide an updated report to EPA with a spending plan capacity. I showed you the cover page of that report. Now I just make a note here that the next spending plan capacity report, as indicated in Act 64, is due on December 2021. And then the last two were to focus on combined sewer overflows. Although they typically become a small source of phosphorus, they can still be a source of phosphorus. But most importantly, as you all know, that when, unfortunately, when partially treated or untreated sewage through combined sewer overflows end up in receiving waters, that is a public health risk. And we had recently replaced the 1990 CSO control policy with a 2016 rule, and we completed that task. And then finally, to develop a comprehensive tracking and reporting system. And I think you've all seen the benefit of having that tracking system through the release of those interagency reports that show a consistent way that we're tracking and reporting on our progress is an outcome of this tool. And so those 16 elements were under year one. And then there's a second set of another 12 elements. Oh, sorry, I went backwards, didn't I? Oh, no, here we go. So again, another set of expectations for the second year, which were to be completed by December of 2017, which involved ensuring that we, as described in the Phase 1 plan, the Agency of Agriculture had listed a number of nutrient management plan milestones that they expected to have completed by this date. And note that the report that I'll again include a link to describes what those milestones are. But that task was completed. The next item was talked about targeting funding specifically to Missisquoi Bay, St. Albans Bay, and South Lake, because we recognize those are real challenging parts of the watershed, really need to target additional funding and technical resources to the farmers in those communities. And the report goes into depth about how we're accomplishing this task, but know that it's just not a single year effort. This is an ongoing effort to assist in helping farmers in these areas. They may be the more challenged watersheds in terms of our trying to achieve pollutant reductions, but know that they're also key parts of our rural, our agricultural economy. This is where we have important parts of our economy that contribute to that 60% milk production for New England. And so we really want to support farmers in helping them keep the soil and nutrients on their field as opposed to in the water. The the milestones include a report to the legislature on tile drains, and we completed that report. It asked for proposed amendments. Oops, I don't know what that Q means, but it's supposed to be the RAPs to the required agricultural practices to include requirements for nutrient contributions to tile drainage, to complete education, outreach, and compliance activities to farms within the Missisquoi Bay watershed, and to commence notification of farms related to what's referred to as the Secretary's decision, which was a settlement between the Conservation Law Foundation and the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets to, again, further more to complete more targeting of practices in the Missisquoi Bay watershed. With respect to stormwater, we were to issue a final municipal roads general permit, which was released in January, to issue a final developed land general permit, which is ongoing. We did not meet this deadline, but the report describes our expectation to complete this permit by the end of this calendar year, and so we're still keeping us on target for implementing this permit. We anticipate beginning our rulemaking process related to this permit in April. It requires us to revise the large municipal permit that we have for our larger communities called the MS4 permit to require phosphorus pollutant reduction controls, and that's an ongoing effort as well, but we anticipate releasing that draft. We did release that draft permit in February, and a new target date for completing that effort to update these MS4 permits by this coming month. And then with respect to tactical basin plans, it would expect us, we have 15 or so basin plans around the state. A subset of that are Lake Champlain Basin, and we have a schedule for completing the updates to the Lake Champlain tactical basin plans over the next few years. This accountability framework points to completing the Polteny, Meadowy, and Lower Lake Champlains, which we did complete. With respect to funding, it directs us to establish a long-term funding source, which is a still ongoing process. The governor, as you know, had committed the last 2 years of additional funding above baseline spending, a substantial amount of funding to support fiscal year 18 and 19 implementation goals, and we are continuing to pursue options to support our revenue needs in the coming years. And then finally, it asks for an update to the Vermont water quality standards to allow a greater opportunity for reclassifying streams and their designated uses to have a more protective class. Having this new protective class creates incentive for enhancing and restoring waters. So that was what we call the Accountability Framework Period 1. It's quite a list. I think having 16 elements year 1 and 12 in year 2 is quite an effort. But we anticipate hearing from EPA any day now on how well we've met their expectations.
Question from Pam. Can you give us a projected date for the developed lands permit release, and when you plan to do more outreach to the business community on this permit?
Oh, absolutely. I think it indicated that I think there's a legislation draft bill in the legislature right now that directs the Agency of Natural Resources to release that developed lands permit or to begin the outreach process this April. And we anticipate that will entail quite a bit of public outreach and comment throughout the year for a final adoption by December. I think that the report goes into depth about that particular, each of these elements, and describes that process. Okay, so that was period 1. Period 2 is to assume that now that you've established these programs and policies, the future period is post-2017, and it covers the rest of that 20-year planning and implementation period. It's going to be watershed specific, meaning it's going to be looking at each of the, based on tactical basin plans, so it's going to look at each of the progress that we're making in terms of identifying, prioritizing our resources, implementing projects at the watershed scale, and then tracking our progress to ensure that we're securing those reductions we're aiming to achieve across all sectors. As I mentioned, it's tied to those tactical basin plan implementation tables, and we're going to be under an extremely tight leash here. Every 2.5 years, we are to provide information for EPA to provide an interim report card on how well we're doing, and then a final grade at the end of that 5-year planning period to determine how well we're meeting our targets. Now again, and there would be consequences for failure if they determine that it's systemic across a sector or perhaps a watershed. They would tailor any consequences accordingly. Now keep in mind though, in our minds, I mean this seems draconian, but in our minds it seems important, because in this way we can use this accountability framework to be smart about how well we're doing. And if we happen to be falling short, it tells us that we need to reallocate more resources, target more effectively at where we can maximize cost effectiveness, engage the public on what our challenges are and how to overcome some of those barriers. So in our minds, that this becomes, this accountability framework on the implementation phase really becomes that opportunity for us to really adapt our efforts to make sure that we're achieving the local water quality goals that our local communities within these watersheds want to see happen. Okay, and so here's a link to the Restoring Lake Champlain watershed where you can access the accountability report, all things related to Lake Champlain that include the TMDL Phase 1 plan and our contact information. So I kind of moved pretty darn quickly through that, all the elements in that, but we're here to now open it up for questions. Before we open it up, maybe Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add at this point, or should we just rely on the Q&A?
I thought you did a pretty good job of giving the overview, and if there's specific questions on that, I'm happy to answer them.
Great, thanks. Open it up for questions in the room and online.
When are the farms required to comply with the RAPs?
Now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, as of the RAP rulemaking process finished in December 2016. Oh yeah, finished in December 2016. There's different components of it that took effect at different periods of time, but at this point in time, all farms should be that meet the threshold for being farm should be following the RAPs.
Now, the required agricultural practices became the opportunity to engage farms in the development of those RAPs. Know that the Agency of Agriculture did not work in a vacuum. They engaged the farm community and really tried to provide a transparent process by which all farms could understand the reasons behind these changes to the agricultural practices. They're still interpreted as being kind of your best practices for farmers and kind of meeting kind of a baseline of water quality improvements and to ensure that all farms are being treated equal. But also note that our fundamental goal is to help farmers as well by helping them reduce erosion off of their farm fields. You're helping them improve the soil health. you're helping them keep the nutrients on their ground as opposed to having it wash away. You're providing more technical assistance in helping to problem solve on how to reduce water quality problems. And it's the approach we've taken across all sectors to ensure that certainly our goal is for water quality, but how can we be smart in ensuring that these investments are not only helping water quality, but helping the farmer, helping municipalities, for example, reduce their vulnerability to flooding, save money in the long run by doing best practices along their road networks, for example. So much of and that 4 or 5 years that went into the development of this TMDL and all that public meetings were really about how to be smart at targeting those dollars where we can maximize the benefits for our communities, our businesses, and our farmers in a way that really engages Vermont in a collaborative way.
It's like Pan is typing a message online. Any other questions in the room?
What?
What did I say?
Okay, yes.
You have these rivers that are running into the lake. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think the northern one is Lamoille.
The Missisquoi. Yeah. And then the Lamoille.
And then the one below that is the Winooski.
Yes.
Missisquoi runs into Missisquoi Bay. When you look at a picture of it, the aerial view, it seems like there's a vast delta that's been built up with soil that's eroded from further up and washed down the river. You would have to assume that that buildup of soil is just totally laden with phosphorus. So, since that's going to be leaching out for the next several decades, even if you have no further input of phosphorus coming from any of the farms, what proposals do you have for removing that? And is dredging on the table here?
Well, actually, we refer to those at the water quality problem that you identified as a legacy phosphorus problem. And you're right. The legacy phosphorus that's built up in the sediments in the lake are fundamentally because of the millennial, the decades of water coming into the lake working really well as a sink and having all those nutrients build up into the soils. And the residence time of moving all that legacy phosphorus through the lake to drain into the St. Lawrence, the Richelieu River into the St. Lawrence, is quite significant. So you're absolutely correct that that's a fundamental struggle, problem that we have in some parts of the lake, including the Missisquoi Bay. Now, described in the Phase 1 plan is a recognition that at some point in some portions of the watershed, it may make sense to do in-lake treatments associated with that legacy phosphorus problem. First and foremost, though, it's important to turn off the spigots, address all the sources, because otherwise you're throwing water out. You're wasting your investment if you're focusing on trying to remove phosphorus from the water column or from the sediments when you are still getting a lot of input from the rivers continuing to drain phosphorus-laden water into the lake. So it's important that our first effort is to be pollutant source reduction. But described in the Phase 1 plan is an acknowledgement that in-lake treatments may be a strategy to address that in-lake issues. So for Lake Missisquoi, and I'm thinking also of Lake of St. Albans Bay, are two areas where we've looked at and evaluated them for potential in-lake treatments, mostly looking at alum treatment, maybe dredging, but really that's looking at what kind of in-lake treatments would make sense after we turn the spigot off. So yes, you're correct. We're focusing on kind of those in-lake treatments. It's what's going to haunt us in meeting water quality standards even when we turn the spigot off, is how long it's going to take in terms of residence time to reduce phosphorus within the lake itself. But those are options we and have considered and will continue to consider.
Just to follow up on that those delta areas of alluvial material that have washed out into the Missisquoi Bay specifically. That's now basically, because it's above the water level, has basically become a bird flyover, bird sanctuary. How do you propose to address the absolute howls of protest that you're going to be getting if you decide to dredge that out of there from the bird lover crowd? Because I see here an incompatibility, so you're going to have a conflict. And it doesn't strike me as one that's resolvable through political channels. And it's a scientific issue, but it's not amenable to a scientific solution because you have these political issues that are going to be coming in the way. If you don't get that enormous amount of material out of the lake, you're not going to resolve it, no matter how many spigots you shut off. I mean, that's just my point of view.
Yes,
and I really think that you just got so much saturated material and a relatively limited drainage pattern that if you don't dredge it out, you're not going to resolve this issue, not in my lifetime anyway.
Right. No, very good point. What we do know is, keep in mind that the TMDL for Lake Champlain is 13 individual TMDLs. We're talking specifically for the plan with respect to Missisquoi. We've been mostly looking at alum treatment as opposed to dredging as the potential in-lake treatment of choice for that, and had conducted a feasibility study a few years ago looking at that question. And what resulted out of that study is to really work harder at turning the sources, addressing the sources first and foremost. But you're right, it's a ongoing challenge for us. And you're also correct to point out that in any decision, when you're focused solely on one problem, there may be unintended consequences of creating other problems. Another example where that is evident when we're worried about the fish hits of what's the sea lamprey, and when you try to treat rivers and streams for sea lamprey control, you have impacts on native amphibians, and that also shows how complex some of this decision making is in terms of how to move forward with some of these controls. And what you point out is kind of the important issues or political realities that we face every single day when we're grappling with this. But I think we all recognize the important benefit it is. At least it may not be in our lifetime, but it'll be sometime in the future if we can continue to work on source reduction. But those are good arguments, or good concerns.
The chemistry of how you would treating this phosphorus. I mean, phosphorus is not pure P, is it? I mean, what is it, P4O10? I mean, how is it coming into the system? And what does the alum do chemically? Can you just touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, what I'll do on that is we could take that question offline because this one's specific to the accountability framework, and I could share with you that report that looked at alum treatment for that area. And we also know phosphorus is one of those elements that does change form. Our standard is related to total phosphorus, so we do tend to focus on total phosphorus, not just the available dissolved phosphorus element. But know that I'd be happy to help you get a better handle of that, some of the questions we face, and we welcome your thoughts and input on that. I do want to. Is there?
I have a question. Yeah,
okay.
From Pam online. She was wondering if you can speak to how regional planning commissions can better support towns in project prioritization. She's aware of working and does work with their tactical basin planner, but wondering if there is other mechanisms or means to assist municipalities in identifying projects that would be competitive for ecosystem restoration funding.
The question is fundamental to understanding how we're going to be implementing this TMDL over time. And we turn to the tactical basin planning process as that what we call the roadmap or the phase 2 implementation plan for that particular watershed. That planning process is updated every 5 years, and develops and continues to maintain what they call a watershed projects database that contain, or implementation table that contains specific projects. We evaluate those projects for pollutant reduction potential, and our goal is to maximize cost effectiveness of these investments. But we also recognize that we have pollutant reductions across all sectors required under this TMDL. So even though it's expensive, for example, to upgrade wastewater treatment plants, the TMDL still has this expectation that there will be a certain amount of pollutant reductions coming from upgrades to wastewater treatment plants. There's some 61 plants, wastewater treatment plants in Lake Champlain. We're targeting some 13 or so for this, for our pollutant reductions. Similarly, when you look at stormwater, stormwater controls off the hard surfaces, we know that retrofitting existing hard surfaces like parking lots is expensive, but still there's this expectation that we need to reduce a certain amount of pollutant reductions coming off those hard surfaces. And our strategy to accomplish that is twofold. One is on the municipal roads general permit, and we're supporting that effort through a new grant program that doesn't require a grant application called it's a direct aid program through the regional planning commissions called the grant and aid. But then the second category of pollutant reductions expected from stormwater will be associated with this developed lands general permit, which targets, it's already done some prioritization, targeting those larger hard surfaces, those larger parking lots, for example, that have undermanaged or not managed their stormwater runoff, targeting 3 acres or greater. So in many ways, when this permit comes on board, it's going to already have identified those hard surfaces as a priority for meeting those stormwater controls. The ecosystem restoration grant, and then of course on natural resources too, we have expectations of so many river and floodplain restoration efforts we need to achieve to meet the pollutant load reductions related to natural resource restoration. So we use the ecosystem restoration grants to help support and subsidize the pollutant reduction needs for these other sectors. So in my mind, the regional planning commissions are already a close partner in the development, in addition to that grant and aid for municipal roads, are an important partner in the development of the tactile basin plans and those implementation tables. And so I see in their engagement with municipalities. So I see that this TMDL and the implementation of the TMDL will turn to partners such as the regional planning commissions, the League of Cities and Towns, other groups, in helping to make the most robust basin plan implementation tables and help us with respect to targeting our funds wisely. Related to targeting, I do want to mention that when we're smart at targeting those projects that can maximize cost effectiveness, we actually, as opposed to simply relying on opportunity that should come our way, in other words, if we target our dollars where we maximize pollutant reductions, we improve our cost effectiveness threefold. So we would want to see that our limited state funds available to help supplement or support the implementation be geared towards assisting those municipalities and other entities in meeting their water quality goals through these permits, as well as to maximize cost-effective pollutant reductions.
I have another question from Dan Albrecht. Is there any chance that the department can put more direct language in the ecosystem restoration grant announcements to make it more clear what types of projects they would like to see funded? Right now, money is going to whichever projects get applied for rather than which projects should be funded because they have the best bang for the buck. So I guess looking at cost efficiency.
I appreciate that question because we believe in continuous improvement, and that kind of feedback is really helpful. We've undertaken a number of what we call lean business process improvement efforts to evaluate our grant management and targeting and efforts to ensure that we are providing a clear roadmap for project proponents as they seek funding for their particular project. So that kind of feedback is helpful. We anticipate releasing, as you know, we have 4 grant deadlines throughout the year with a rolling process where we have deadlines and then batch those applications. We plan on releasing this week a slight update to our grant manual to help project proponents understand better what we're seeking with the use of these dollars. We anticipate, however, a major overhaul for next fiscal year. So stay tuned. We're hopeful that with your feedback and our interest to improve the efficiency of these dollars and the targeting of these dollars, I'm hopeful that we can get to a point where we're providing a good roadmap for how to seek funding in a very clear and transparent way.
Great, thanks.
Now, I would like to point out one thing. One thing I didn't really cover is the consequence question. What happens if, say, we don't do a good job, or at least the EPA feels that that we fell short in this first, what I'm calling the first stage of the accountability framework? And then what happens in the future stage after 2017 during implementation? And so part of that consequence is listed on page 57, where EPA at least is, as you know, it's due any moment now. I was hoping we'd have it by now, and the EPA's final report card for this first phase of the accountability framework. And as I understand, it should be here at least by the sometime next month, if not this week. But I have a feeling, and I'm a pass-fail kind of gal, and so I was hoping for, passing means what, C- or something. But when you saw all those checks and a few notes, I think in my mind I thought we were doing pretty darn good, because it's we work really closely with our sister agencies to get this work done, and we might have, a couple of deadlines might have slipped, but I think we worked really hard to try to meet these expectations, because again, I want to emphasize these are our waters and we care about them, and I think we did pretty darn good. So I imagine we're going to get, and last year EPA's interim report card said, yep, you're doing pretty good. So I'm hopeful that we're going to be looking okay. Obviously, I have a sneaky feeling what they'll probably comment on is the funding question, since they are wanting to make sure we have the capacity to implement this TMDL. And we have, fortunately, a Clean Water Fund that carries us with something on the order of $4 million a year to 2027, where it sunsets. So we have another 9 years or so of funding. And as you mentioned, this couple of years we've benefited from having more capital funds, but where it's unclear what the future is going to look like there. So it really does involve legislature and it's tough times, and that's why we really want to maximize the cost effectiveness of our investments and to keep a transparent process. But should we fall short, what they're going to be looking at, where did we fall short if we miss these deadlines, such as the developed land permit. They will probably want to hear about what, if anything, to give an update on where we fell short for these policies and programs. And I think the Agency of Agriculture has done great. I think it's mostly us falling short here. And I think that's the other policy or program that they're probably going to comment on. And then in terms of the implementation, they're going to see, we have 20 years to implement it, but how are we going to be doing every 5 years is kind of an important question to ask, and we want to ask that question as well. So EPA, as described in here, is going to look at what part of our plan did we fall short, and we'll probably comment on that, and they'll tie consequences into the degree to which we fall short. So I have a feeling this first set, we should be okay in that they might comment on those two elements I mentioned. It's the next set that's important, and their consequences can be substantial, meaning that, as we pointed out with that pie chart showing that 94% of our water quality problem is related to runoff or erosion, the TMDL has to achieve a lot of pollution reductions related to runoff and erosion, related to what we call these non-point sources. Should we fall short in meeting the reductions related to the non-point sources, the consequences are that you have to find those pollutant reductions from the point sources where you have a federal permit. And that means the consequence could be broken down again by watershed, but it might be greater controls at wastewater treatment plants. So although we focused on 13 of the 61 wastewater treatment plants in Lake Champlain under this TMDL, we might have to do more. It could be more stormwater control. So we targeted those 3 acres or greater large surfaces for this general permit. We might have to go to 2 acres. So, and those are under, Vermont has delegated authority for implementing the Clean Water Act, the federal Clean Water Act, and those permits are under the federal Clean Water Act. And EPA could increase targeting of enforcement and compliance work. So I point that out because those are pretty draconian measures and are very expensive. It has the potential of dramatically increasing the cost of recovery for Lake Champlain. And this is why we absolutely need to be successful. We need to keep you engaged. We need to help Agency of Agriculture in their work with farmers in particular, because that is the single largest source of phosphorus reduction. We need to help municipalities, and we need to do it in a partnership that's kind of the Vermont stamp, this partnership approach. So I mention that because they're pretty draconian and costly, but I think we can get there under our original plan with your help and your engagement.
Great. Well, we are out of time. I just want to thank you, Kari, and thanks, Mike, for presenting today. And I also want to make sure to highlight next month's Clean Water Initiative lecture. So Jessica Belova, who's our wastewater program section supervisor, and then Teresa Thomas, who is our water infrastructure finance supervisor, will be co-presenting on the progress of combined sewer overflow abatement and control, and they'll be providing some background on the 2016 combined sewer overflow rule, case studies on recent municipality improvements, asset management, and available state funding programs. So that will be April 12th at 11 o'clock this time in the Winooski room, as well as online via Skype for Business. And for those of you who want to follow up with additional questions, Kari and Mike's contact information is on this last slide. We'll also be posting the recording of this on our Clean Water Vermont YouTube channel, which is where you'll find all of the other past Clean Water Initiative lectures. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you.